Welcome to our webinar to launch the Transition Pathway repository hosted by RMI. Thank you for joining us to see our first public demo of this tool. My name is Tom White. I'm a manager on RMI's climate finance team, where I've been co-leading our work on corporate transition intelligence for financial institutions. And the tool we're launching today is a key part of that work. So during the webinar, please feel free to drop any questions that you have into the Q&A function on your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can during a live Q&A at the end. For those of you viewing this as a recording, please reach out to our team if you have any questions. You can find my email on the slide here alongside Nara Herrera, our engagement lead on this project, and I'll share these emails again at the end as well. So this webinar will be up to an hour long. We'll start with a quick introduction to RMI for those of you who are new to our work. Then we'll get into an overview of the work we've done this year, the motivation for it, and why we think transition pathways are so important. Then we'll get to a live demo of the Transition Pathways repository tool itself and finish with the live Q&A. So again, please feel free to drop any questions that you have into the Q&A function on your screen. For those unfamiliar, RMI is an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that transforms global energy systems through market-driven solutions to secure a clean, prosperous, zero-carbon future for all. RMI has grown to more than 600 experts working on 4 continents now. We are passionately nonpartisan and non-ideological, and as a non-governmental organization, we have a mandate to promote the public interest and the public good. We work with individuals, corporations, communities, foundations, and government leaders around the world to create a clean energy future for all. We work across 4 key sectors: industry, mobility, buildings, and electricity, powered by these strategic market catalysts, including policy, finance, business models, data, technology, and education, and across critical geographies important to delivering a just energy transition. My team and I are from RMI's climate finance program, which is focused, of course, on the finance catalyst and creating tools and guidance for financial institutions to navigate the energy transition. And our latest work to that end will be the subject of our discussion today. So in the climate finance team this year, one of our focuses has been on the current execution gap that we see between transition relevant information on the left here and real world decision making from financial institutions. Transition relevant information and data is becoming more common and more accessible than ever through third-party data, transition planning, and transition plans, and all the good work from a number of organizations working in that space to set clear and ambitious expectations for the kind of data that corporates should disclose. And FIs are using transition assessments to pass this information and try to make use of it. However, we see some key limitations in the current landscape. Firstly, though the existing guidance on transition planning is highly ambitious, implementation has been limited, and corporates and FIs are often not putting the level of detail into transition plans that we would want to see. That has generally been our experience when reviewing FI and corporate disclosures. Secondly, even with the level of implementation that is there, FIs can be flooded with new information, but without a clear use case within a financial institution. And we're seeing that many are simply not sure how to make best use of this information or struggle with the capacity to process it. And this results in fairly high-level transition assessments, which don't offer significant value to the organization and ultimately end up being largely disclosure-focused. And finally, corporate transition plans still have fairly low uptake, particularly in emerging markets. And so while we certainly support the growth of transition planning and transition plans, we want transition assessments to be doable without a formal transition plan. The result of these limitations is that existing corporate transition assessments are not informing real-world transactions in supporting real economy change. They're ultimately becoming focused on labeling and disclosure. And so in much the same way that climate targets so far have been seen to drive limited real economy change, I think there's a danger of making the same mistake with transition assessments and having them relegated to a checkbox exercise. We need to make the connection between transition plans on the left here and real financing decisions on the right in order to affect real change. And that means assessments of transition plans need to ask harder questions about a company's pathway to transition. So what does this pathway actually look like? What technologies does the company need to leverage? Do those technologies have the abatement potential to actually deliver on their targets? When will these technologies actually be available? And does that align with the company's target timeline? What are their plans for their high carbon assets? Are there opportunities to retrofit these or retire them? So we see 3 critical improvements to transition assessments to bridge this gap. The first here is transition footprint mapping. This is identifying the transition exposure of a corporate at a really detailed, asset level, and understanding when and how the most exposed assets can or should transition. For example, can these be retrofitted in some way, or do they need to be retired? And what does that retirement timeline look like? Secondly, here we have investment alignment. So looking not just at targets, but at how the actual investment pipeline is expected to perform against those targets and against a range of transition pathways as well. And it's crucial here that we look beyond targeted ambition and assess the actual investment pipeline. What actions is the company actually taking? This data is more difficult to obtain and process, but we've found this to be very achievable in major sectors like power generation and steel production. The third step here is dependency mapping. So identifying what enabling conditions a corporate needs in order to successfully navigate the energy transition. This provides input to risk management, portfolio target management, and possibly business development, as well as a financial institution can invest to address these dependencies and mitigate their own transition risk at the same time. This structure from these 3 key improvements goes much further than box checking and creates real value for financial institutions across functional teams, not just for disclosure. For more detail on this, we put out a white paper earlier this year called Creating Transition Intelligence, laying out in more detail our thinking here, which we'll link at the end of the webinar and also should be dropped in the chat now. A critical input to implementing these 3 improvements that I just talked through is region and sector-specific transition pathways that cover a big range of assumptions. And so when we say transition pathways, we want to be as inclusive as possible. So we're referring to any forward-looking description of how companies, sectors, or regions may evolve over time. And that includes the IEA models that you'll be familiar with, like the NZE, APS, and STEPS. That will include sector-specific models from NGOs and industry organizations, but it also includes nationally determined contributions and even just simple policy targets. No single pathway can answer every question a financial institution has about a client or investee. Ultimately, approaches that deploy a diverse range of complementary pathways will provide the most granular and actionable insights for a corporate assessment. And so for any given region and sector, in an ideal case, we would have transition pathways showing different policy scenarios, different technology roadmaps, and different levels of ambition on a temperature basis. These different pathways can then answer different questions about how might policies or market developments enable the deployment of critical technologies? Do a company's investment plans align with what is feasible or likely in a given region? Are corporate climate commitments credible and compatible with their own institution's strategy? In this example on the right, we've created a forward-looking emissions trajectory based on planned investments from a corporate here in the light blue line. And we've compared that trajectory to a global 1.5 degree benchmark, a policy-driven pathway, and the company's own target. We see that the company is projected to fall short of their target here. And this highlights a potential area of engagement to understand the reasons for this shortfall. It could be a lack of ambition. It could be a dependency on infrastructure, which is not available. But this gives a concrete place to start for an engagement team to have a discussion with this client. They also are expected to fall short of this global 1.5 degree trajectory. This may not be an informative benchmark, though, from a risk perspective, given their geography in an emerging market. But it is useful to show that if the portfolio has a 1.5 degree target, this company is not going to help to meet that and would need to be offset by an overachieving company to keep the portfolio on track. We can also look at the comparison to the local policy pathway benchmark at the top here. And we see that their target is in excess of the local policy pathway, which shows high ambition, but may also indicate a policy dependency that warrants further investigation. Now, this is an idealized case with multiple scenarios available. The scenarios are often not available, or they may be hard to find and difficult to interpret and identify what assumptions they've actually made to drive the transition. And financial institutions are used to making use of one or two transition pathways, often, again, the IEA NZD or the APS, but we really want to expand that universe of pathways that financial institutions are exposed to and can make use of. But we acknowledge that that can be a resource-intensive process. And so, to make that process of identifying and interpreting pathways as easy as possible, RMI is developing, and we're happy to launch today, the Transition Pathways repository. The goal of this tool is that for any given sector and region, users can come to this resource with confidence that every available pathway relevant to that sector and that region is stored here, and they can find the pathways that suit their needs. Then, for every available pathway, users are provided with 4 key things. The first is an expert overview of the pathway drafted by our team here at RMI, which provides a clear description of the pathway, its primary change drivers, and recommendations for how it can be used as part of a transition assessment. We also provide a list of standardized key features for each pathway, which indicates basic metadata such as the geographic coverage, the degree of policy ambition, the new technologies deployed in the pathway, and many more that you'll see soon. There are metric visualizations for each of the key benchmark metrics, such as the technology mix or the emissions intensity for each geography covered by the pathway. And again, you'll see charts of these soon. And finally, we also provide a standardized data set of that benchmark data, hosted in the repository where possible, where data use allows, and with a link to the original sources if the pathway data can't be hosted directly in the repository. Right now, the first iteration of this tool covers the power sector in Southeast Asia, but as we'll cover at the end, we do intend to expand coverage in 2026. And now I'll pass over to Jacob Castle to walk you through a live demonstration of the tool. Jacob.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Just quickly share my screen. Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jakob Kastel. I'm a software developer and senior associate here at RMI. And I help coordinate the development of the tool that we're launching today. Yeah, and I'm happy to give you a brief live demo of the new Transition Pathways repository. You can find the tool at pathways.rmi.org, and this is what the landing page looks like. We have a high-level explainer of the repo here on the left, and then 2 further boxes on the right that both link to the thought leadership papers that we have released as part of this project on corporate transition intelligence and on how to select appropriate pathways for that. There is also a short disclaimer here mentioning that the repository right now is still being piloted and that the scope of it right now is the power sector in Southeast Asia. And we are planning to extend that beyond the power sector and beyond Southeast Asia next year. Okay, without further ado, let's take a look at the actual tool. This is the main screen of the repository. It's called the pathway card view. You'll see in a second why. I'm just quickly going to talk us through the main structure, or like the main parts of this view, and like what each of these are being used for. This top ribbon here is called the step-by-step guide. And basically that is a summary of the 4 key filters that we provide to find the best fitting pathways for the questions that you may want to answer, with a bit more context as to why choosing a certain value for a filter may be the right choice for you. They can be joined in combination, they can be joined independently of each other, and we're going to see them in use in a second. Below that, we have a search bar. The search bar can obviously also be used to drill down on the pathways that you may want to find. We'll also see that. And then drop down filters to basically fine-tune your search if you feel like you need to filter further. At the bottom of this page, and like if you scroll down, there are going to be quite a few of those. We have the pathway cards. Each of these cards shows one pathway, and the cards themselves they contain basically metadata on each of the pathways, such as names, type of pathways, pathway targets if there are specific ones, information on scope and granularity, and on the types of metrics that you can expect to see as part of this pathway. Right now, we have 40 pathways available in the repository. We're going to be adding further pathways until the end of the year. So I'm hoping to get to around 50 or 60 by the end of the year. And that's just for power in Southeast Asia. And then there will be more next year once we expand the tool. Okay, now let's take a quick look at the type of information that you'll get when looking at the details of a particular pathway. And just choosing the first one here. The structure of the detail view is, again, as follows. We have this top ribbon here that just summarizes the name, like very, very brief summary of what the pathway is about. In this case here, the type of the pathway. There can be pathway targets here as well in case there are any, such as the temperature outcome, the publisher, and the year of publication. And then below that, we have a lot of the real content, a lot of the real meat, if you will. On the left side, we have a large text section. That is the expert overview. This is the summary that we have created here at RMI. And that expert overview is split into 3 subsections. The first section here, the pathway description, again, shows the scope of the pathway and the broad trends, basically like the high-level outcomes of where the pathway is expected to take the power sector. Below that, we have the core drivers section. The core drivers section basically explains the key assumptions used in this pathway that explain the main trends. So among those key assumptions could be the dimensions such as policies used under the model, technology cost assumptions, changes in the demand profiles, those types of things. And the main ones are mentioned here, and they will be varying a little bit depending on the types of pathway. But you can see that in examples and, of course, explore later on. And then lastly, the last bit of the text section here is the application to transition assessments. And that is a section that we have created to explain how the narrative and the structure of the given pathway that we're looking at fits different types of questions related to corporate transition assessment. So that's basically the types of questions that Tom briefly went through before. Again, depending on the types of pathway, the geographic granularity and scope, not all pathways will obviously lend themselves to all types of questions that you may have, and this section should highlight if the one that you're looking at is in fact one that you can consider. Okay, beyond the text section, we are going to take a quick look here at the plot section, top right. The plot section summarizes the key trends for the sector-specific metrics that we are covering right now. Again, we're looking at the power section, the power sector thus far. Those 5 metrics here: technology mix, absolute emissions, emissions intensity, power capacity, and power generation, are the sector-specific metrics that you can find here, assuming that the pathway has that information. We can just, for demonstration purposes, click through them, and you will see that depending on the type of metric, you get different plots here. For pathways that have different levels of geography, you will be able to select those as well. In this particular case here, there's just one geography, so you'll see how that looks in another example in a minute. Below that, we have the key features section. Again, something Tom also briefly touched on. But what this is, yeah, basically trying to do is to summarize in a structured way the key assumptions, the key trends of the pathways that we're looking at, scopes and granularity of relevant pathway dimensions. And some examples here are, for example, the trend of the of the energy demand summarized. Then you can have information on technology cost trends. You will get information on the policy used in the pathway, and for example, which types of new technologies are assumed to be available in this pathway. This should hopefully be a quick overview that you can look at if there are any specific assumptions that are particularly relevant for your question that you're trying to answer. And it makes it a lot easier to compare some of the high-level assumptions between pathways. Okay, then lastly, there are three other boxes here on the right that show you the available coverage in terms of geographies and sectors and which metrics are available. A geography here will only show up if there are results for that geography in the pathway. So that means there could be input on country level in the pathway. If there is no output on country level, it will not show up. It will just be the region level. Likewise, in the sector section, if there are no sector-specific outputs, the sector will not show up. If there are sector-specific outputs, the sector will show up. Even though we list more than the power sector here, I want to remind you, right now, the pilot version is limited to the power sector, so this is a scope that we could get to once we expand the tool. And lastly, the benchmark metrics box, again, a summary of the sector-specific metrics that are available in this pathway. Very last bit I want to mention here. At the very bottom, we, of course, mention where the information of this pathway was taken from. If it was taken from a report, we link to that. If there is a supplementary data set that was used, we'll also link to the data set. And where we are allowed to actually host some of the data that we mentioned here in the repository, there is a download functionality available here. And that will produce a standardized format download. I am going to quickly show you what that looks like. This is going to be a CSV format. We're obviously not going to look at this in detail now, but this is going to be the same format that you will get for every pathway if there's a download available here. And also just to tie that together with the remainder of what you can see here, basically what you're getting in that CSV download is the exact same set of values that you can see in the plot in the top right corner. Okay, those are all the main features briefly shown. And now I want to go through some examples that hopefully replicate some rather close to real life use cases, so that we can see what this repository can hopefully help you with. I hope they're all relatively brief, but should be reasonably close to questions that you come across in your daily work. So use case one, we're going to look at a case where we're trying to set a global portfolio level target, and we want to set a 1.5C aligned target and need a reference pathway for that. So how are we going to find an appropriate pathway in the repository for that? We're going to start at the step-by-step guide up here and click on temperature rise. Since we're looking at a 1.5 pathway, I'm going to set that slider to 1.5C. And I can set the drop down to global, and I will get these two pathways right now as a set of possible pathways to look at. I'm assuming that we're all familiar with this one here on the left, IEA net zero emissions by 2050. That's an obvious candidate. I'm not going to go through all the details here in the details page again, but yeah, just wanted to demonstrate that this is one of the candidates that would show up here. And you will see here some of the pathway targets summarized at the top, what I mentioned before. Okay, now we obviously don't always want to set global targets. We may have a portfolio that is a bit more concentrated. So let's assume we have a portfolio that has a specific focus on one country, Vietnam, for example. And we still want to set a target with an ambition no higher than 1.5 C. Now I'm again going to start using the step-by-step guide. I'm actually going to start with a pathway type here. Pathway type is a categorization, well, of the types of pathways, obviously, and we're going to select a normative pathway. Normative basically means that the pathway is driven by a climate outcome, such as net zero or a temperature outcome, versus a lot of the other types here that are not driven by that, but by other types of pathway assumptions. We're going to get to that later. Okay, so looking at normative pathways, we're going to go to the next part of the step-by-step guide. Again, we said no more than 1.5 C temperature increase. And with that set, we already have the repo filtered down to 5 pathways. Now, we said that we wanted a pathway that covers Vietnam. So you can type Vietnam here in the search bar, and that is going to look through a bunch of the parts in the scenario information for that word, and it finds it here in the geographies. It only shows pathways that have Vietnam as a geography. For demonstration purposes, let's take the JRC 1.5C scenario. You will possibly notice that it actually says it has 1.3 target. That is the case because the pathway actually peaks at 1.5C, but we said 1.5 maximum, so we're going to be fine with this for demonstration purposes. And here I just want to quickly show you what the geographic coverage looks like. Again, we said that we're trying to set a target here. Target setting in many cases uses emissions intensity as a metric, so let's do that. And we're looking at a global target here. We said though that we're interested in a more regional way of setting targets. So we can see that at the global level, we're starting at a value of around 0.43 for the emissions intensity. At Southeast Asia level, that's up to 0.61. And for Vietnam, similar 0.61, just with a slightly different trend than at the regional level. So this is basically the level of geographical granularity that you can get there. Again, also the different metrics and plots are available there, and that is a way that you can hopefully find a adequate pathway for setting targets in a more geographically narrowed situation. Okay, let's look at the third example. We're obviously not always going to be setting targets. There are other questions that you may want to answer. So let's look at something different here. We're assuming that we have a client that is a utility in Southeast Asia. And we now want to analyze how that client's plans in terms of investments align with the long-term policy plans in that region. And let's assume that we also want to keep working on that question afterwards. So we want a data set to be available for download. We can achieve that by starting off with the policy ambition as a filter. Again, we were trying to look at long-term policy plans in the region. That sounds quite a lot like nationally determined contributions might be a good start. So we're going to select that. You will see that in the drop-downs, this would correspond to 2 values actually, because that is the opportunity to fine-tune that. If you want to look at unconditional only or conditional targets only, then you can do that. But for now, we're going to keep both. We also said that we want a download version available. So the last filter here in the step-by-step guide is data availability. If you click on freely available ones, then that will only show you pathways that we are able to host download data for. And with that, we have these 5 pathways left. I'm going to select the ACE regional aspiration scenario, which is one that is aligned with NDCs, including conditional targets. And within this, I am going to just quickly show you the technology mix again. You can use that if you want to compare the plans of your client to the Southeast Asian region based on those policy assumptions. But of course, technology mix may not always be the most appropriate metric for that, especially if your client starts off with a very different technology mix, and this may be a bit of a hard comparison. In that case, maybe it makes more sense to switch to capacity and see if the trends of investment plans that your client has are in alignment with these. Now we wanted to be able to download this. Again, I already showed you that there is a download button at the bottom here. I also showed you how that works. I'm going to click on it. I'm not going to open it again because we have seen that that is a big CSV that replicates the plots up here. But yeah, this is basically the quick and easy way to get a lot of these benchmark data onto your machine and ready for further analyses. Okay, last example I want to quickly go through is, let's assume that the utility is actually based in Indonesia. That is your client, and you want to analyze the risk of their plans deviating from existing national policies in Indonesia. And existing national policies is basically an assumption where not too much is assumed to be changed, or not too many new policies are assumed to be coming in. So what we are looking for is a rather conservative estimate, a rather conservative pathway. Again, we're going to start to look for that by choosing the right policy ambition. We're going to select current and or drafted policies for that. And we said that we're going to look for a pathway that covers Indonesia. So I will look for that here. You could also technically choose the drop down, but personally find it a bit quicker to use the search bar here. Okay, and those are all the filters that we wanted to set. Current pathways, Indonesia. Now I quickly just want to talk through some of the different types of pathways that are showing up here, because I think there are a few different ones in here that are maybe quite interesting to hear a comment on. First one, top left here, the IESR business as usual scenario. As you can see, this one only shows one benchmark metric. Most other show more. That just shows that there may be cases where you do not get all the benchmark metrics that we would hope to be available for a sector. And you may have a question where this particular metric is sufficient, then you can use that, but maybe you're looking at something else, and then that will disqualify that the pathway for that particular question. So that's something to always have in mind. Then the ones here at the bottom, the transition zero pathways, are relatively focused on the power grid. So if you have a question related to the power grid, they may be very useful, but they, for example, they don't cover any other sectors. So if you have any questions on the dependencies, then maybe they would work for that in terms of power grid, but not in terms of other sectors. And then lastly, we have some of the big IAMs here, JSC and NGFS. Before I jump into those, just quickly, you see that obviously if you filter to the criteria that you may have, you will not always just have one pathway, and that will not always be the perfect, correct pathway for you. There may be multiple pathways that we show. And in fact, we think that it's in many cases a good idea to run many of the analyses that you could run if you're looking at your corporates against pathways from different publishers. None of these are a clear forecast of the future. They show different futures. We have all heard that. And what that means, especially for a use case that involves risk, you probably learn more by looking at multiple different pathways. And in that sense, this is a pretty good outcome for that. And The good thing is that this repo hopefully gives you some transparency on like what the main differences are between these, and that should make it a bit easier to run these multi-pathway analyses. Last comment here, we were looking for a conservative pathway, and you see that the ones that do have a temperature outcome here have relatively high outcomes, 2.6 or 3 degrees. So that again matches our expectation here. And then just briefly here, JRC reference pathway. This is, yeah, again, one that we could look into for the particular region that we're interested in. Reference pathway global versus Southeast Asia. We already see a change in technology mix here, and then our utility is based in Indonesia, and that again changes the trend. Again, download is available if you need that data for further processing. Yeah, and that summarizes basically the main types of use cases that we wanted to highlight in this demo. Now, before we conclude, I just quickly want to review what we've seen here. The repository helps you find pathways for different use cases, including use cases such as target setting, alignment analyses, risk analyses. I'm sure there could be more. And in fact, we will be very keen to hear from you about use cases that you could see this tool to be useful with. Again, the pathway currently covers 40 pathways, focusing on power in Southeast Asia. It will be expanded both this year within that scope to hopefully 50 or 60 pathways, and then to more sectors next year. You can download a standardized format version of the data that you see in the plots here for several of these scenarios, not for all of them, depending on the data licenses that we have in place. There will also be more added there in the near future. And where you cannot download it, there are going to be links to the pathway developers so that you can get the data from them. Again, the tool is meant to make the identification and comparison of pathways hopefully much easier, and this demo hopefully showed you how you can use that to enrich your transition assessments of corporate clients. And with that, I want to encourage you to visit pathways.rmi.org, test it out yourself. Let us know what you think. We appreciate any feedback on it. And I will wrap up the demo here and pass it back to Tom.
Thanks very much, Jacob. Okay, so to close us out, I want to take a second to highlight some of the work we've published this year on the subject of transition intelligence, which supports the use of the repository. Our first piece here is on creating transition intelligence, and that really lays the foundation of our view on the best practices for a corporate transition assessment and the value that it can bring. And that piece lays out those kind of 3 key improvements and goes into more detail there. We also put out this piece, Delivering Transition Pathways, which sets out a process for identifying the right pathway for a given use case and how to interpret it. We published this. We also published a piece on the importance of regionalization of transition assessments, further emphasizing the need to account for local context and gather usable insights and the role that regional transition pathways can play in that. Just this week, we published a technical reference for financial institutions looking at the current state of the transition in the power sector in Southeast Asia and effectively performing a transition assessment of the region as a whole. And the intent of that was to give financial institutions a base then to build from when performing assessments of individual power producers in the region. And finally, we have 2 how-to guides, one on transition footprint mapping and one on assessing the alignment of investment pipelines. These are 2 of the key improvements I laid out earlier. And these guides provide accessible and concrete steps for putting those improvements into practice. And you can find all these resources and more on our Transition Finance Resource Hub, as well as a link to the Pathway repository at rmi.org/transitionfinance or at the QR code here. And we'll put a link in the chat as well, so it's easy to find. In terms of what's next, we already have 40 pathways covering the power sector in Southeast Asia in the repository, and we'll be completing that with 15 more included before the end of the year. But obviously, that only covers one sector and one region. So in 2026, we are planning to expand power sector coverage to more geographies, as well as to expand to other sectors. And we'd love to hear from you on what you think of the repository from what you saw today, what geographies you'd like us to cover next, and what sectors, and what features would be most useful as well. So again, please feel free to get in touch with us at the emails listed here. We'll also be sending out a survey in the next couple of days to those that receive direct invites to provide your inputs on these topics as well. With that, we'll move to the Q&A. So please feel free to drop in any additional questions that you have. But I see there's a few that have come in already, so we'll get started answering those. I think the first one we've got here is our current coverage at a country level. So this depends very much on the country. And I think a number of scenarios that are country specific are just being finalized now will be uploaded before the end of the year. But for the major Southeast Asian economies, kind of Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines, we have multiple pathways specific to those countries in each case. I think a lot of those developed by AGF, the ASEAN Green Futures initiative. So we have a number of, I think each of those has 3 or 4 pathways showing kind of a highly ambitious pathway, as well as a current policies pathway. In terms of like, there's also then Southeast Asia specific pathways and a few global ones as well, like the IEA, NZD, and APS. We have another question here on the threshold that pathways have to meet to be included, so the level of credibility. We try to be fairly inclusive here. So as long as a pathway is developed by a reputable developer and it's internally consistent, kind of mathematically sound, we include it. We don't necessarily want to step into the realm of what's a credible future. We want to demonstrate the kind of full range of what has been modeled, as long as, again, it's mathematically sound. But then we want to make as transparent and accessible as possible what assumptions have they made, so that then users can make their own assessments about, is this kind of, do I consider this a credible future? Is this relevant to me, or have they made assumptions that I don't agree with, so then I won't include those? And so we've tried to make those assumptions as accessible as possible so you can make that judgment for yourself. We have a question, could you explain the 4 pathway types again and the differences? Jacob, do you want to speak to those pathway types?
Yeah, sure, I can do that. Okay, so the main 4 pathway types that we currently have in there are predictive pathways, exploratory pathways, normative pathways, and direct policy pathways. Predictive pathways, we don't have too many in there, and those are basically the ones where the assumptions are mainly in line with historical trends up until now, and don't really add any further assumptions that go beyond that. Exploratory pathways are a lot of different ones. That could be all kinds of futures that you look at. Yeah, basically, they could look at very different types of outcomes, such as reaching all the targets of all global NDCs. They could be something like a degrowth pathway, even not very common, but could be like that. It's basically something where the outcome can be relatively broad. It's not a climate-based outcome, but rather a, let's say, like narrative-based outcome. And the exact outcome is then specified in the details of the pathway. But it's an outcome that sort of deviates from current trends. A normative pathway is one where we have basically a climate outcome as a starting point, if you will. So for example, if a pathway is created with a 1.5 C as a constraint, with a 1.5 C temperature rise as a constraint, and is set up in a way that sort of the trends must lead to that outcome, then that's a normative pathway. Or a different type of that would be a net zero pathway, for example. Again, like a climate-related outcome sort of determines how the trends within the sector can they develop. And it is like basically like part of the construction of the pathway that climate target is reached. And then lastly, a direct policy pathway is one that is based on policy documents from a usually like national authority, could be a regional one, depending on yeah, who's responsible for that. But that could be something like a power development plan, for example. And those, again, are the four different types of pathways. The direct policy one, maybe to clarify, we have that separate because that does not necessarily have to be a model-based pathway. It could just be based on the targets that are set out in whatever way they make their way into the policy document.
Yeah, and then just speaking to then how you might use those. So a normative scenario in general is going to be a higher ambition scenario. So you can use those for benchmarking ambition, particularly where you have a temperature alignment associated with that as well. So that kind of sets the upper bound on ambition at different levels of granularity. And then exploratory pathways kind of cover the full range, but often within that range, you would see like for different kind of levels of policy ambition, what might the outcomes be? So depending on kind of what's coming down the pipeline, what policies you might expect, what kind of market changes and price reductions and low carbon technologies you might expect, that kind of will cover a range of different outcomes there. So you could look at potential kind of technology and policy risk within a pathway. And then the predictive and I think direct policy pathways that are more for kind of given the current state and the current outlook, what is my current policy or market risk if kind of current trends and current policy environments hold, is I think broadly how you could break down the general use cases of those categories. Another pair of questions here. So do we plan to extend the repository to other geographies in the future? And why start with Southeast Asia? So in terms of extension, yes, planning to expand our power sector coverage to other sectors and also expand into other sectors. Exactly kind of which we do is still up in the air. I'm very keen to hear feedback from users and from our center partners as well to understand their priorities and then make a decision based on where we think the highest need is. In terms of why starting with Southeast Asia, I think it's a really important sector where there's a lot of growth. And so there'll be a lot of new investment in energy generation infrastructure. And so making the right decisions now, avoiding carbon lock-in where we can is really important. And we wanted to provide a tool to be able to do that. It's also a high priority sector for our stakeholders. And it's also an emerging market where I think quite often data limitations are cited. So we wanted to test that assumption and see kind of what pathways are available for the power sector in Southeast Asia. Are there more? And we found a lot more than we expected to. I think it'll be 55 once we're done. And we weren't sure, if we get a dozen. So, and as well, we wanted to make that as accessible as possible so that people have kind of as much information as possible for performing transition assessments in the region and then making decisions accordingly. One more question here we've got is there a way to compare the different scenarios that we might have shortlisted based on the criteria? Jacob, do you want to take that one?
Yes, so there is currently not a functionality implemented that allows you to compare the pathways side by side in the repository, but we do have that feature planned again for the expansion of the repository next year. So that will allow you to select a number of pathways that fit your criteria and yeah, sort of have a more side-by-side comparison of the assumptions and possibly the outputs on screen. Right now, you would have to basically open the pathways separately and compare that, or download the data sets corresponding to those. And well, since they are standardized, it will still be pretty easy to at least get a comparison of the main metrics there. But yeah, a more intuitive version of that is going to be worked on as one of the next steps.
And just a question again on the data access, Jacob, could you reiterate kind of the different levels of data access and what's available directly in the tool?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so for any pathway that allows basically sharing the data that we're trying to showcase here, we have the data freely available in a form of plots and standardized download functionality. In those cases, you will see at the bottom of the detail view a reference to the report, a link to the report, and a download button with a little disclaimer. And then there are, of course, also cases where we are summarizing pathways, but the data license of the pathway may be one that does not allow us to like replicate the raw data on our platform. In those cases, there is still going to be a reference to the report at the bottom, a link to the report, and usually a second link to where you can download the raw data directly from the pathway developer. So that will take you to a third-party website. In that case, of course, the data that you would find there might not have the same format that we're using, but we try to standardize in a format that is rather intuitive. So I think in many cases it will still be pretty easy to sort of get that into a similar format. And then, of course, in theory, there could be pathways that are very relevant for some reason because, for example, they are just commonly used or that are commonly referenced, but that do not allow us to share data and also do not make a data set or like that also do not provide a data set on their third-party website. In that case, we would just reference the report and would highlight that or that we are not aware of a way to get data for that. But like those three levels are available. Freely available means there's a download and plots on our website. Available from the publisher means there's at least a link to where you can get it. And then lastly, like not available, very rare, but it could also happen, and then we just link to the report.
Thanks, Jacob. And we had one last one come in. So is the idea also to expand this repository with new scenario updates from different organizations that are already included in there, like the IEA and NGFS release every 1 to 2 years? Yes, I think so. I mean, the ultimate ambition is that every scenario is in there and the latest scenarios as updates come in. Exactly what that looks like is kind of, I think, still up in the air, but we do want to keep this as up to date as possible with the latest scenarios where new ones are published. And I think that's a priority for us next year to think about the ongoing maintenance of this tool as we expand, but also make sure that the sectors and regions that we've covered remain up to date as well. Okay. We don't have any other questions coming in, so we can finish up 5 minutes early. So thank you all so much for joining this webinar to launch the Transition Pathways repository. We hope you'll dive in, test it out, and let us know your thoughts. We've certainly been excited to work on it this year and share it with you. We have been recording this session, and the recording will be posted on the event page within the next couple of days. So you can check it there for reference in future. Thank you again, and have a lovely rest of your day.